Talking about this idea of an integrated approach to healing, recognizing that there are a lot of things that govern or control or affect the healing process. And we've defined, hi, Kim Donaldson. Hi, Mike Donaldson. Didn't expect to look down and see you guys. Anyway, there's a lot of things that govern or control or affect the healing process. And healing, of course, is much larger than just physical healing, although we kind of reflexively go to physical healing. But I think especially in a society like ours, where we have the best medical technology that history has ever known, but we don't seem to be able to sort out matters of the internal life. And two of the really big buckets are mental health and sexual matters, which, by the way, these two are very tightly linked. I don't know if people are aware of that, but I'm convinced that a very large percentage, not 100%, you always have to make these statements to clarify, because people will glom onto it and they'll say, it all comes from sexual stuff. No, it doesn't all come from sexual stuff, but a lot of it does. Because when people are prematurely sexualized, and biblically that means before marriage night, or marriage afternoon if you had a morning wedding, when people are prematurely sexualized, it does things to their minds. It's a well-known statistic within the psychiatric community that 90%, not 19, 90, 9 out of 10, 90% of women who are in mental hospitals in the United States of America are victims of rape. Does it play with your head? Oh, you bet. Does it create health issues, mental health issues? Absolutely. What's one of the biggest problems that we're having with our youth? There aren't many youth in here right now. There's one over here, a couple back there. All you old people over here. But one of the biggest problems that our youth are dealing with is what? That anxiety, that sense of not even sure who they are. And I will tell you, you start ministering to people seriously in transformative ways in stuff like that, with the anxiety, with the lack of confidence in life, the suicidal thoughts, or maybe not just thoughts, maybe actually intent and desire, continual fascination with death. You start talking to people who are carrying that around, even as teenagers, and what you're going to find is that most of them have had some kind of premature sexualization. It might have been rape, it might have been voluntary, but even at that, a lot of it's what we might call coercive voluntary, right? They have a boy that they're interested in, or it could be a girl, and send me sexts. Do we all know what a sexts are? Do I need to define my terms? Okay, so they start sexting back and forth, and then it gets shot out all over the school. Well, this is very humiliating, and even though everybody says it doesn't matter, it actually does. We're hardwired by God to understand that this is not okay. And if we take a biblical understanding of sex, it's not just doing an act, it's literally just the uncovering of nakedness, which, by the way, leads us right into the conversation about pornography and why it's so destructive and why it causes men to become passive, unable to be leaders in their homes, unable to love their wives well, because they are uncovering the nakedness of another, presumably woman, but sometimes they get into gay porn, so whatever, another human being with sexual intent, with arousal intent. They're doing all of this on a regular basis, and it's literally destroying them on the inside and eroding their soul. And so all of these things are more the matters that we deal with than, it's not that people don't get sick and die, it's not that they don't have physical health problems in America, but many of the things that used to assail our race have been, I would say, overcome through medical process and science through the years. Many, not all. For example, I prayed for someone with cancer last night. We don't have a cure for cancer. They were talking about a cure for cancer when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, and they still don't have it. And it seems like it's like the horizon. It keeps moving out. The closer you get, the further it is. So I'm not making the statement that physical matters don't matter, or physical health issues don't matter. They do. But the things that really consume our thoughts these days have to do with matters of our internal lives. And so when we come to our next category of healing, we're talking about healing of past hurts or inner healing. Now, this is primarily about the emotional life, but it's also about the memories. And as I indicated last night, if we think about the human soul, it's been well understood for centuries in classical Christian theology, which nobody teaches anymore, but doesn't mean we shouldn't be, at least a little bit, enough to get a working knowledge, that the soul has three primary parts to it. We've got our emotions and we've got our memories. And then, I don't know, if you want to think of a triangle, you could put the point up here or you could invert it and put it down here. But the third point would be the will. And so the will also comes into play, but it's a little more difficult to work with, and you really need to understand the other stuff pretty well before we start talking about the will. So for that reason, I'm not really going to go into that this morning. So this category of healing, it's got different names to it. Up in Reading, they call it sozo, and that's fine. You can call it sozo if you like to. When I first got started with this, literally the founders of this whole movement were still alive. So they had names like Agnes Sanford and Tommy Tyson, and there were a number of others. One of the kind of early leaders who is still with us is Judith McNutt. She still runs Christian Healing Ministries in Jacksonville, Florida. She was married to Francis McNutt, and they had an interesting marriage because Francis, it's not that he didn't do any inner healing, he did, but he was more known for physical healing and some deliverance. Judith was always kind of the inner healing one, and she has a degree in mental health, a master's degree, and they were a very dynamic team. Francis died during COVID, not of COVID, but of old age. So now Judith's on her own, and she continues on with Christian Healing Ministries, CHM. I think she uses the term healing of past hurts. But the point is, in all of this, whereas last night we were talking about sin that originates with us, things we've done, which may be affecting us, and this is a bright line. You really need to have this as clearly separated as these two sections and this center aisle. This needs to be in your mind, or you will fail as a healer. I'll just say this clearly, because you'll be chasing things down that aren't even a thing in the person you're dealing with if you don't understand this difference. So if you've sinned, you're responsible, you're culpable. That's sickness of the spirit, and the baseline for that is repentance. But when we're talking about whether we call it inner healing or sozo or Emmanuel prayer or RTF or some of these other names that people have put to their methodologies, their techniques, this is always about sin sinned against me. It's inbound sin versus outbound sin, if you want to say it that way. Outbound meaning I did it, inbound, I received it. And if you get that idea clearly in your mind, that will help you a lot in distinguishing between these two. Because in past times, I've had people just get completely wrapped around the axle about, well, doesn't sin create this and that? And well, but somebody hurt me, and so I don't know. I sinned back. They sinned against me, and the whole thing just turns into mush. So when we're talking about this category, as before, I'll give you a definition. We'll look at some scriptural examples and look at how it operates. So the other thing I want to say is, just due to the nature of the way the human organism, the human system functions, all of these things interact with each other. And so it might well be the case that when you're dealing with somebody who needs freedom or restoration from something, let's assume for the moment that they sinned and they initiated this very unhealthy dynamic that they ultimately entered into. Well, when they sinned, they hurt somebody, and maybe that somebody responded. They returned fire. And so now the sinner has become the sinned against, and so now they are hurt and they're carrying that around. Now, if they don't recognize their own culpability, that'll turn into a victim mentality. Hello, United States of America. Is every person in this country listening? So you've got that dynamic, but then they return fire again, and suddenly you have what we call codependency. You get this loop. And so somewhere, somehow, you got to stop that loop. and people have to take ownership for their own part, but then they need healing from the damage that's been done to them. So, again, under this idea of definition, while sickness of the spirit is caused by what we do, sickness of the emotions or sickness in the memory is caused by what is done to us. And it grows out of the hurts done by another person, or perhaps sometimes an experience to which we may have been subjected, but we can't particularly pin the blame on a specific individual. Now, last night, I said, we aren't really going to have ministry time, and my wife and my daughter ditched me and left me for dead. I need inner healing. What's that? You're going to pray for me? That's good. You can administer medical care, too. Anyway, there was a woman who came last night, and I knew she was going to be present. I didn't know if she'd be here last night, but I knew she was coming to these meetings because she and her husband are friends with somebody that I know from New York City, even though he's now living on the West Coast. So he'd messaged me and said, hey, could you pray for her? And he said, I don't really know what's wrong with her. Nobody really does, but anyway, she needs prayer. So I ended up praying for her because her husband couldn't be here today. I think she's going to be here in the afternoon, but he couldn't be here today, and he wanted to observe. So she had an interesting story, and I don't want to, because she'll be in the room, she might even be here now, but I don't see her, so. Okay, so I'm not going to go into all the detail because I don't want to embarrass her or divulge, sensitive information. But I will say this, on this topic of sometimes there's no face, there's no person associated with it. She grew up in Lebanon, and it was during the time of the Lebanese Civil War. And part of what needed to happen for her healing was to deal with today we overuse the term trauma, but it was trauma, of explosions in the streets, of the sound of gunfire, of walking down the street at any moment a car bomb might go off, and you could lose friends in that, or you could lose your own life. And then as it happened, although that obviously never occurred in her life where she was herself harmed in that manner, the psychological impact, the wounding of the memory, the emotional damage of hearing explosions, of watching buildings get hit with artillery fire, of hearing gunfire, and on like that, that was laying a foundation in her life that was very, very damaging. And what she came with was a kind of an ill-defined, they call it fibromyalgia, but the point is they couldn't put their finger on it, but she had this pain in her whole body. That was her issue. And so this is a very important concept in inner healing called roots and triggers. Roots and triggers. So last night I gave you the idea that if you have a tree that's bearing fruit you don't want, you better cut the root so that you get the fruit. And there are oftentimes roots that are laid down early in life which seemingly have no impact. Note that I say seemingly. But one of the things that we know is that trauma in its many forms, and again, I don't like the term trauma. It's way overused, and nowadays, everybody's in trauma, and trauma has just become a new form of drama. But there is real trauma, so if we can discriminate one from the other, then I think it's okay to talk about it when it's a clinical issue. So, anyway, roots and triggers, what happens is trauma is cumulative in its effect, and what typically will happen when you have a root and trigger situation is that whatever that root was, however it got laid down, sometime later in life, and when I say sometime later, it might be 20 years. So don't think like next week, although it could be next week. But with that, oftentimes people lose track of this happened, and so they don't see the correlations. They don't see the interconnectedness of what's been happening in the person's life. Does that make sense? So roots and triggers, there'll be a subsequent, later in life, trigger event, and suddenly the roof caves in and all hell breaks loose. So what was this person's trigger that went with that root of the Lebanese Civil War with all of the explosions and gunfire and car bombs and all the rest? As it happened, she and her husband were at the Boston Marathon when that bombing went off, and they were close, like from me to that wall, to where the second bomb went off. There was the trigger event. And right after that, this ill-defined fibromyalgia began. Well, you could treat it, I guess, with a lot of morphine, but that's not really treating the root, is it? It's treating the symptom. So that's why I was talking about symptoms and roots last night, or roots and fruits, and now I'm giving you a further concept of roots and triggers. So anyway, we prayed into all of that. The power of God came on her very powerfully, and she was amazed that her hands weren't hurting, and her legs, which had gone completely numb, were no longer bothering her when she left last night. So this is an example of the power of inner healing, and it can bring about physical effect, but sometimes there isn't a physical exhibit or exhibition or presentation. Sometimes it's purely in the realm of the mind, but the point is these things can be solved. I'll give you another example of that on a demonic level when we get to that piece of the teaching, but it shows you how powerful of a concept this is. So these hurts, as I say, they can grow out of what another person did, or it can be ill-defined or amorphous. So the root in this story of what happened in Lebanon, I mean, obviously there were people who were firing weapons and blowing things up, of course, but they weren't particularly aimed at this woman. They weren't directed at her, but nevertheless the impact came upon her. Does that make sense? And then, of course, the Boston bombing, that wasn't really directed at her and her husband any more than it was directed at, well, anybody else who happened to be at the Boston Marathon that morning who just might happen to be the target of a terrorist attack. So it wasn't really ad hominem, as we say, but nevertheless the impact had that effect. Now, you really got to get this concept in your head clearly too, because one of the things people often ask me, especially in this module of this teaching, so I'm going to answer the question you didn't ask yet before you ask it. So one of the big questions that I get from people is, how do we pray for Alzheimer's? How do we pray for senile dementia? And the first thing you have to understand is that they're not quite the same, but they look very similar. So dementia is really a chemical thing, and it has to do with neurotransmitters in the brain. And Alzheimer's is a physical degradation of the neural structure in the brain. And if you look at it under a microscope, it looks like moths have eaten the brain tissue. And my daughter's nodding her head, so I passed the medical exam. All right. Or at least at the layman's level. So they're not quite the same, but they present the same. So people always say, well, how do we pray for this? How do we see people get healed? And I see a lot of people get healed of it. And so here's how I think about that. And it's directly tied to what I'm about to teach you, but I'm going to give you an example before I get to the teaching. Because sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words. People who have either of these conditions commonly have one of three things going on. One of three things going on. Three. The first option is they did something somewhere in their life. It could be more than one something, but we'll just take the simplest case and say one something. And they would like to forget this. They don't really understand forgiveness. They may not even be Christian, so they wouldn't even have a framework for that. But like the woman I described in Australia who couldn't get clear about that, even though she had language for it, she didn't really have genuine belief. That's what's going on there. Whatever that thing is, they can't get beyond it because they're racked with guilt. They're racked with remorse. They're racked with shame. You could throw other words on the list, but that's option one. Option two, they had something done to them. Now, if it's the first option, what is that? That's a sin sickness, isn't it? If it's option two, what I'm about to tell you, this is inner healing. Something was done to them. So, it doesn't always have to be a sexual example. Maybe they got bullied at school. I remember praying for a guy in Australia in a part of the country where the weather is very hot, even hotter than Fresno. And that was supposed to be funny. And they build their houses on low stilts, and so there's like a crawl space under the homes, and all kinds of things end up in those crawl spaces. Snakes, wombats, sometimes a koala that falls out of a tree, whatever. But stuff ends up under the house. Well, one day this guy was walking home from school, and there was a group of kids in this class that bullied him. They didn't like him. And they started to chase him, and they were throwing rocks at him, and so he crawled under one of these houses, and he was a little smaller than these other boys, and they couldn't get under that crawl space. So on the one hand, he was kind of safe, but they took rocks and they were throwing him under the house like this, trying to hit him. And they were hitting him. So something was done to him. And that might be the kind of thing that could create an Alzheimer's or a senile dementia scenario. A lot of times people go to war and they do things or see things done or have things done to them, right? So I think an important part of the whole PSTD conversation has to do with things that might have been done to you in the context of perhaps being a POW. A lot of our Vietnam vets suffer with this. And a lot of them have very big mental health issues that include dementia and Alzheimer's. Okay, so your second option is something that was done to you. So case one, they have a sin sickness form of it. Case two, it's an inner healing thing. Case three is slightly different, but it's closer to case two, and that is they didn't do anything and nothing was done to them, but they observed something. They were in the context of it. So I've seen this, for example, in families with multiple kids, and maybe dad would beat one of the kids. But for whatever reason, the other kids didn't get beaten. But they saw it, they heard it, it was traumatizing, it was terrifying. They're standing by, they're nearby. Well, that's going on. So they need to be healed of that memory. So in a sense, it was done to them, but it wasn't physically done to them. There's still an impact from it. Does that make sense? Okay, just trying to be really crystal clear about each and every one of these. So what happens is that's all your root, and now later in life, the career curve maybe has flattened out. They're probably not getting another big promotion because they've reached that age where big corporations don't really promote you. Or the kids are grown. So the burden of caring for them, being sure they're well attended to, that they've done their homework, they've gotten settled in life, they've finished their education, they've gotten married, whatever it might be. That's all in the rearview mirror. And so you've got this situation, and the way I like to characterize this is a metaphor, it's a word picture. Think of somebody who likes to ride horses, and maybe they like to ride bareback. They don't have a saddle and reins on the horse. And let's say it's someplace that gets a lot of fog. The Central Valley can get a lot of fog at certain times of the year, but so do the Highlands of Scotland and all that. So any place that has a lot of fog, could be Big Sur. They've gone horseback riding, and instead of hanging on to the horse's neck or maybe the mane or however it is you hang on when you're riding bareback, they just let go of the horse, and they let the horse run where it will. And they run into a fog bank. You can still, if you're standing by observing this, you can still hear it go as the horse is galloping, but the hoofbeats are getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. And of course, they're in a fog bank. They can't see. They can't find their way out. They don't know where they are. They're losing their sense of orientation and perspective. How do you heal this? Well, first thing you've got to do is figure out, did they do something? Was something done to them, or were they an observer to something? And then apply the appropriate prayer technique. So we talked last night about how to deal with the sin sickness one, and in this thing this morning, we're going to talk about what to do if something was done to them or they observed it. So how are you going to get that information? Well, if they're not too far gone, you can ask them. If they are pretty far gone, ask their near family and friends, because nearly everybody talks a little bit about things that bother them. Often they don't talk much, but they can at least tell you what that thing may have been, and you'll at least have some definition around the problem. Then you'll use the appropriate prayer technique, and once you've prayed inner healing over them, or forgiveness of the sin sickness if that's the problem, now we summon them back out of the fog. So think of yourself standing on the beach in Big Sur, and you say, Janie, come back to us. Well, she's in the fog, but she can orient by your voice, right? Does that make sense? Summon them, literally, like Lazarus, come out. That same kind of thing. Summon them out of the fog and summon them back to you. And I've literally seen it happen. I was in New Jersey a couple months ago, and I prayed for a woman they brought in who had very advanced Alzheimer's, and it was Alzheimer's. And we had to, I actually had to talk to her daughter and son who had brought her about what was her issue. And they didn't know a lot, but they knew a little bit. So we prayed what we knew. Now, with this one, you have to be led by the Spirit, and you'll just pray according to your best understanding, whatever that is. You'll feel weak and lame because you don't have full knowledge, but you still do it. And then I called her out of the fog, and she literally kind of did like this, and she looked and she said, "Oh, it's so nice to see you." Her daughter was right here on my left. She said, "Where are we? I didn't know that we were coming to church." And she starts talking with her, and she goes, "Mom," whatever the brother's name was, "he's right behind you." She turns around, she goes, "Oh, how nice to have both of you with me." And she says, "Well, now that we're all together, after church is over, can we go to lunch?" They start crying. They're like, "What just happened here?" So these concepts are super powerful, but you do have to move slow enough to make sure they work. A lot of times people want to pray these prayers in 60 seconds or 90 seconds. That doesn't work very well, does it, Robert? You got to take the time and let these things unpack. So for her, that woman in that wheelchair that morning in New Jersey a few months ago, I think I prayed with her about 20 minutes, which is relatively quick, but I kind of knew what I was after, so that accelerated things. But don't think you're going to do this in a 60-second prayer at the altar. If it should happen, you got lucky and you had a miracle. There you go. There's your answer on that one. So anyway, the last thing that I normally do with people who have, whether it's dementia or Alzheimer's, is I'll pray for physical healing. So if it's dementia, we're going to pray for a rebalancing of the body chemistry, that the neurotransmitters would all be correct. And if it's Alzheimer's, we're literally praying for a miracle, the restoration of brain tissue that's been eaten up or decayed or whatever the right word is. Anna could explain that. But that's how we do it. All right, so now that we have an example in front of us, let's talk about some of the things that can cause damage to whether the memories or the emotions. And again, because of the way the soul is structured, these two are linked. Oftentimes you have memories which are very painful, and sometimes you have pain, and it's mental pain, it's emotional pain, but you don't really know why it's there, and then somebody will say something, and you'll reconnect the dots. By the way, when we talk about people getting triggered, this is often what's going on. They're carrying around this anger or this pain. By the way, anger is pain. Anger is always emotional or psychological pain. It may not be specific yet because they may have forgotten or they may not realize the linkage between what they experience emotionally and what their memory is. But when that whole linkage comes together, the penny drops. So when we're dealing with people who have this sort of thing, we've got to move in on the particulars of what the memory is that may be attached to the non-localized emotional pain and difficulty. And of course, when all of this is going on, when we have damaged memories, when we have wounded emotions, oftentimes we make bad decisions, don't we? We make bad choices. Somebody's phone's going off. Can we silence all phones? Okay. And so as we do that in response to what we're carrying, many times we get into sin. Our sin becomes a coping mechanism. And there's all kinds of sin that we might get into. We might fall into depression. We may have a sense of worthlessness or inferiority. We might have fears and anxieties that don't seem to be grounded in anything, and in that sense, people say they're unreasonable. There may be what we call psychosomatic illnesses with no apparent cause, maybe like this fibromyalgia last night. So included in all of this are the present-day effects as well of the sins that travel in our bloodline. Now, that's a bigger conversation. I'm only noting it here because someone will probably ask about it. But I'm not really planning to teach on generational iniquity here. We don't have time to do it this weekend, but I do have a very thorough standalone teaching that you can get on the Advanced Deliverance MP3 card, or you can download it from our website, or you can purchase it in our store, however you want to get access to it. And so when we're talking about these healing of past hurts, whatever they may be, we're dealing with emotions and memories, and sometimes bloodline stuff. David Seamans was one of the early founders of the inner healing movement, and he wrote a book called Healing for Damaged Emotions, and he talks about 4 big bucket categories, 4 big buckets, and they all begin with H, like every good preacher or writer should do, right? You got to have things congruent so people can remember them. The first is hurts. So what are hurts? Rejection and abandonment. Now, rejection is when somebody actively rejects you. Get out of here. We don't want you here. We don't want you in our club if it's a bullying type situation at school. Sometimes in a family. You're not really part of this family. Things like that. Abandonment is a little bit different. It's not as active. It's not as intentional. It's more just neglect or leaving someone behind. One person I prayed for in Australia had been driving across the great desert that's in the western part of the country. Australia is approximately the same width as the United States is from Los Angeles to Boston. So they were driving across the Great Empty is what they call it out there. And they stopped and his parents got in the car and drove away while he was in the bathroom. Now, that could happen just because of oversight. I mean, you kind of question a parent that would do that, but it does happen, and we know there are honest mistakes, so let's at least give a little grace for the best possible scenario, but this wasn't that. So he figured, well, my parents, drove off without me. They'll be back in a few minutes when they realize I'm not in the car. They never came back. Just left him out there. And so he had an abandonment thing. Now, I would argue that crossed the line from basic abandonment to rejection, because when you realize your kid's not in the car and you don't come back, now there's intentionality in it. Do you see that? So it's important to start thinking about what's going on in terms of what people intended when we talk about these things. But anyway, these are 2 big categories of hurts, of rejection and abandonment. The second category is humiliations. These would be things like embarrassment, shame, feelings of inferiority, feelings of inadequacy. I'm not good enough. My sister's somehow better than I am. My brother is the better athlete. That kind of thing can be part of what needs to be rectified through this discipline of inner healing. The third H is what we call horrors. So these are things like fears, anxieties, and terrors. And oftentimes they are rooted in early memories. I remember praying for one woman who, her family, both parents worked, and so they would bring her over to the neighbor's house to be with them before school. And then when the school bus came, they would put her on the school bus and off she'd go. Well, the parents were still working when she got home, so this next door family had agreed also to keep her during the afternoon until Mom and Dad got home. It seemed to be a perfectly safe and acceptable situation, except what was actually happening, and she never shared it with her parents, was, and it's not a sexual story, although nowadays you automatically go there in your mind. What they would do is they would lock her in the basement and turn out the light. And she had to stay in the basement until the bus came to pick her up. And then when she got there in the afternoon, they would throw her in the basement again and turn out the light again. Because they really didn't want to be bothered with her. But, it takes a village, so they were doing their part in the village. Sorry, I just had to say that. So she had fears. She had anxieties. She had anxieties about the dark. She had fears about enclosed places. And she had a lot of anxiety about people that she didn't know very well, because these neighbors, she didn't really get to know them. She was locked in the basement all the time. So those were her issues, and it was rooted in that memory of being locked in the basement. So we took her through some inner healing, and that ultimately led to her being freed of those fears of enclosed places, strangers, etc. All right, the fourth H is hates. So these are resentments, bitterness, unforgiveness, anger towards other people, rage, possibly even revenge. So hurts, humiliations, horrors, and hates. These are our big 4 H's that drive the inner healing paradigm. Could there be others? Yeah, probably, because nothing is ever absolutely perfect. But this does encapsulate the biggest share of the kinds of stuff we deal with. All right, now let's look at a few case studies of how this works. So let's go to 2 Samuel, and we're going to look at chapter 6. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, we have the story. Most Americans say Michael, but proper Hebrew would be Michal. And the story goes this way. David has heard that a man named Obed-Edom is keeping the ark of the Lord at his house. And the Lord is blessing his household because the ark represents the presence of God. So the presence of God is resting over Obed-Edom's house. And this is in the aftermath of the destruction of the tabernacle in Shiloh. Most Americans say Shiloh. And so they tell King David about it, that Obed-Edom's house is blessed. And so David, he has a passion for the Lord. He says, I'm going to go bring the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David. And so they're bringing the ark towards Jerusalem, and David is offering sacrifices. But it says, David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. So they're rejoicing, they're blowing horns. And it says, starting in verse 16, as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Shaul, looked out of the window and saw King David, leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. It doesn't say yet why she despised him, but the fact is she is despising him. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And then he blessed the people, and he gave them gifts, and all the people depart, and then the marriage fight begins. And David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Shaul, came in to meet David and said, My, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. Now, she is talking about the uncovering of nakedness. And so David's been jumping and leaping and praising, and even during the Toronto outpouring, they had that one song, I will become even more undignified than this, which is the line that David uses here. So on one hand, she's kind of jealous that, what is supposed to be her private domain, meaning David's private parts, was somehow being exposed. I don't know if his underwear was torn or he forgot to put it on, but anyway, whatever. Too much information. But he says, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord, and I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Shaul, had no child to the day of her death. Well, we know a little bit about the story of David and Saul. There was jealousy and bitterness toward David because of God's blessing on his life. That account is found in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 28 and 29. I didn't read it just because I'm trying to economize on time. But Saul becomes jealous and bitter, and it says he kept a jealous eye on David. And this was when the women of Israel were singing in their songs, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. And so David is clearly, the successor. And while he's bringing this ark back to Jerusalem, he's worshiping the Lord with, we could say, reckless abandon. And Michal sees this, and she despises him in her heart. Now, very likely, as the daughter of Saul, even though she's been given to David in marriage for killing Goliath, even though this is the case, let's just say she probably had some early programming from her dad. I'm giving you to him to be married because this is what I said I would do, and I have to keep my word before all Israel. But you know what I really want you to do is I want you to be a spy in David's house. I want you to make sure that he's not trying to rise up in rebellion and take the kingdom from me, because he surely could. And so she's got a divided heart that's been laid down by things that her own father has said to her. So what principle of life, healthy principle of life, was violated just in all of that? Leaving and cleaving, right? And how many marriages have you known where the marriage is not on a good foundation because either dad's family or mom's family, husband's family, wife's family, are continuing to pull, sometimes both, and they're trying to exert some sort of dominance. They're saying things into the family. Maybe they're seeding suspicion, gossip, discord. What started out as a loving relationship between these two, individuals who got married, that's all being undermined. It's that kind of a toxic situation. Is there sin sickness going on? Yeah, probably. Is there a need for inner healing? Yeah, probably. So when she sees David worshiping this way, she despises him in her heart. She'd never seen her father act that way. I mean, he was somehow a Yahwist. I mean, he served the Lord kinda, but he didn't do it wholeheartedly. And that's essentially at the core of what gets Saul into trouble. The whole story of Saul revolves around the fact that when he was sent to deal with the Amalekites, he didn't honor the Lord's word. He was not 100% obedient. And he makes up this excuse about why he couldn't do what he was told to do. But the bottom line is, he sinned. And so Saul's kind of we know people like this. They might go to church. They might even go to this church. I don't know, but usually we think of them as more in mainstream churches where they go to church, but did they really order their lives according to the things of God? No. And if you try to talk with them about that, you're going to get a lot of, we'd say pushback, right? There's going to be a real backlash to that conversation. So Michal has not actually had, I would say, a particularly godly upbringing. On the one hand, yes, God is part of the scene, part of the scenario, but this is very much the kind of marriage you see these a lot in churches where one or the other member is very devoted, very earnest in his or her faith, and the other one isn't so much, and it's always like a ball and chain around the leg of the individual who is the more devoted, holy, consecrated believer. That's exactly what's going on here. And so she despises him, and she says she despised David because he embarrassed her by disrobing in the sight of the slave girls, as any vulgar fellow, any common fellow would do. And after all, we're nobility. We're the Kardashians. Right? So we've got that whole kind of superiority thing going on in her mind. I was born into royalty, and now I'm married to you, and even if you become the king, I'll still be royalty. She's got all of that in her mind. There's some of that going on in the royal house right now, but that's another conversation. So David turns the conversation around, and he says, well, the reason that you despise me is actually this. You're jealous of me and my worship of God because your heart isn't free to do what I do with the Lord. And by the way, the Lord chose me over your father's house. And so I don't think David was wise in his choice of words, but this is what he said. The bigger difference, though, is that David did not have a heart to rule as Shaul did. David only cared really about the things of God. That's what made him a man after God's own heart. Now, God did give him the kingdom, but the rulership wasn't really the thing that he sought the most. He was seeking the presence of God, whereas his father-in-law, he liked the power, and he infused that into his daughter, and I already explained how that worked. So the weakness in her as a result of what she observed in her father's attitudes, in his behaviors, she surely would, become aware of the attempts on David's life at some point that Saul had made, Shaul. So this strains the relationship. It creates bitterness in her heart. There's there's anger. We could neutralize it and call it emotional distress, but there's that despising, that anger towards her own husband. All of this results in her barrenness. Now, does it result in barrenness because they stop having sexual intercourse? It might have been that, but it might also have been that while they continued in a normal sexual relationship, she was barren because of these inner issues that needed to be healed. And so another thing that, we can come to these stories and they become teachable moments. Many times when I pray for people who are barren, and my wife and I have a good track record of praying for people who are barren,